I'm delighted now to have the opportunity of introducing Professor Brendan Sims. We'd hoped to get Brendan to come along yesterday to join a couple of the first panels when we were talking about the lessons that could be learned from the past. But as you will see from his biography in your pack, he is an incredibly busy man, and I'm thrilled that he can join us today. He's professor here in the history of European international relations at the Centre for International Studies. He's a fellow of Peterhouse. And what he's going to do is to set the context for the next panel by giving us a 10-15-minute geopolitical overview of where he sees the future going in terms of the historical perspective. He will then take a couple of questions, and at the end of that, we will then bring up our final panel. Brendan.
Well, thank you very much, Alan, for that kind introduction. Thank you for having me to speak at your conference. And I apologize again for not having been there yesterday. I will attend the rest of this morning's panel. My brief is, as Alan said, to speak to two things. One is the geopolitical framework of warfare today from a historical perspective. And secondly, to say a little bit about how I see the continuity and discontinuity with conflicts in the past. And I'm to speak for about 8 to 10 minutes and then to have some time for questions. Just let me begin very quickly by getting out of the way the question of who is we? How do we prepare for future war? And I'm afraid fairly robustly Eurocentric in this regard, and I can say this because I'm Irish. So we is the West generally, Europe in particular, democratic Europe, and more narrowly the United Kingdom. So that's the framework from which I will be operating. That's the we. So I'm coming at this from the perspective of a historian. I'm not a military man. I have no military experience whatsoever. I'm not a policy practitioner. I'm not even a military historian. But I am, as Alan said, a historian of geopolitics. And so what I deal with, or I deal in, are not predictions, but patterns. So let me begin with the first complex of questions, very briefly, and that is the continuity and discontinuity with conflicts in the past. And we've tended to hear over the last 10 years or so that the world is very different. Everything has changed. We need to tear up the rule book. The experience of the past, at least the past of the Cold War in particular, is no longer relevant. The past of European history, of the balance of power, all that is passé. And the areas that we were interested in the past are no longer the areas of relevance in our new globalized world. So if we were to take, say, a snapshot, let's say 80 years ago, 1936, what are the areas of principal concern in geopolitical terms? Well, one major issue was Spain, the Spanish Civil War, the question of the balance between nationalists and Republicans, the question of the local autonomy or independence aspirations, say of the Basques and the Catalans. Obviously, in terms of big issues, the huge question in 1936 is Nazi Germany, the European balance of power. Alongside that, how does the Soviet Union fit into this story? Is the main enemy Germany or is it Russia? And the intersection of these concerns in due course was to be Eastern Europe, Ukraine, and the Baltic states. Those were areas of principal geopolitical concern. And what the United Kingdom, or the British Empire as it was then, had to do was to address the question of the balance between its continental policy and its imperial or its global policy, and how it was to operate its continental policy. Did it appease Germany, as we all know? Eventually it didn't. Did it ally with the Soviet Union, and so on? And the reason why I remind you of all these facts, with which, of course, you are perfectly familiar, is that I want to make the point that in 2016, it's a very similar map. Next year, Catalonia is most likely going to move to some form of declaration of independence, if not next year, the year after, at least very soon. That is the timetable they have set out. That will create a huge problem in European geopolitics. It will throw the European Union into disarray. Armed conflict, I think, cannot be totally ruled out. But, of course, the area which is the most obviously similar is Russia. The attitude of Russia, the question of the Baltic states, Ukraine, is of much concern today as it was 80 or so years ago. And so the meta point I'm trying to make here is that the possibility of European high-intensity war, which I know you've spoken about yesterday for some of the period, that spectre has always been implicit in British and European history, and it is much closer today than it was in any time in the last 20 years or so. And the lesson I would draw from this is that Europe, the European balance of power, has always been and will always be central to British security. So if we go back to our snapshot in 1936, yes, most of the British Army at that time is in Palestine, Middle East, Suez base area, and so on, more globally, India. But the point is that when the chips are down, the priorities shift. 4 years later, the story is very different, and 8 years after that, it is certainly extremely different. So Europe was and is where the weather comes from. And I would argue that is the case even when there are major competing global power centers. So you'll often hear, well, the world is very different. Europe doesn't matter so much. What matters is the rise of the BRICS, of China, India, and so on. But the centrality of Europe applied even with the rise of Japan. It was simply a question of priorities. And it's also true, by the way, whether or not Europe is weak or strong. It's self-evidently true if Europe is strong because it provides a threat to UK security, but it's equally true that Europe is central if it is weak because it sucks in instability from outside. And I stress this because I think has been for a long time contrary to the prevailing orthodoxy. We've heard a great deal over the last 20 years about how great power thinking is obsolete and has been replaced by notions of interdependence and global governance. So in political terms, what I'm saying is rather against the political orthodoxy of the recent past. And is also against the recent military paradigm, which of course has stressed the turn from the Cold War paradigm, the emphasis on deterrence and high-end conventional warfare, to complex emergencies after, let's say, 1991, the end of the first, or if you prefer, the second Gulf War. And so to that extent, 2001 wasn't really a break. It marked a shift perhaps from humanitarian intervention to anti-terrorism and counterinsurgency. But in military terms, much of the same arguments applied. So what would this then mean for preparing for the next war? One of the headline questions of this conference. Well, it might mean a mental and conceptual shift, speaking in historical terms, comparable to that led by Henry Wilson in the early 1900s. In other words, away from imperial soldiering and small wars to preparing for high-end European war. So that, I think, is the parallel that we should be looking at. Certainly, that is the transformation the British Army had to undergo in the 15 or so years after 1900. And that, of course, has deep military implications in terms of equipment, the heavy metal, so to speak, of armored vehicles. I'm sure you heard about that yesterday. But also it means a shift in conceptual instruments, more particularly the need to relearn deterrence. And I think that is true not merely for the civilian side of the equation, but also for the military side of the equation. And it was very instructive. I don't know how many people here saw, I think it was a BBC drama documentary as to what would happen in the event of a Russian invasion of the Baltic states. And it quickly became clear that even among really quite senior figures, there was misunderstanding about the way in which deterrence works. And I think that is probably also true for the military. that so much time has now elapsed that some of the basic concepts of the Cold War have been lost. And I think we see this divide, which was true in the British military before 1914, we see the same divide between continentalists and globalists in the army today. It's the difference, say, between David Richards and Richard Shirreff. David Richards, of course, seeing the war on terror, the war against Islamism as the main focus, and Richard Shirreff seeing the main purpose of the armed forces in deterring and, if necessary, fighting Mr. Putin. And this, of course, is replicated in the United States in front of our eyes. So, for instance, we've got the National Security Advisor designate, Mike Flynn, who is very much in the Richards mold, and then the designate for the post of CIA director, Pompeo, who is perhaps more in the shall we say, in the Shirreff mold. And certainly that would be true in the purely military terms, where it's the contrast between Flynn and General Breedlove. Let me move on very quickly to the geopolitical framework to make the point that historically, of course, Britain has always fought wars with alliances. Continental alliances in history have been central to British effort. Think of the wars of the 18th century, 7 Years' War, War of Austrian Succession, Napoleonic Wars, and of course, right the way down to the Cold War. And that's also true of the war on terror. And the assumption is, this is why I mention it, the assumption is that deterrence in Europe will be affected in alliance with NATO militarily and politically with the European Union. But the question I'd like to raise is how coherent and dependable are these alliances now? Think, of course, we're all familiar with this, what the election of Mr. Trump means for the commitment to the Article 5 element of the Charter guaranteeing collective defence for NATO. Think of the French elections. Even if Marine Le Pen is not elected, it is now at least likely that François Fillon will be elected, and his view of Russia is a very different one from the current French administration. And of course, the attitude of many smaller European states, Hungary, Bulgaria, possibly Austria soon. And then the divisions caused by Brexit when it is completed. So the question for the United Kingdom would be who would be our allies and who would be Putin's allies in this new configuration. And it's not at all clear what the situation might be. And insofar as we contrast it with what went before, it's not very encouraging. And the question I'd like to throw out in consequence of this is what impact would this have on the kind of war Britain might fight and where it would fight it? So, for example, if the United States' commitment to Article 5 is in doubt, is the United Kingdom still obliged to defend the Baltic states? And if the answer to that question is no, where would the United Kingdom draw the line? At which point would it deliver on Article 5? And if you go into that territory, of course, you return to the classic questions of British grand strategy going back hundreds of years. What is the area of Europe which constitutes a vital national interest? And that area expanded steadily over time. It began, as you all know, with the narrow seas, the sink ports, the areas on the other side, Calais, and so on. It expands then to include the whole Low Countries, then Germany, ultimately the whole balance of power. And now the front line of the United Kingdom is in the Baltic states. But if it isn't to be there, where is it to be? And of course, this will be affected self-evidently by the global picture, by the preoccupation with the war on terror and Mr. Trump's preoccupation with China. And I mean that not simply in terms of diverted attention, i.e. the Americans will have less time and effort and resources to commit to Europe, but also in terms of the trade-offs that Mr. Trump might demand. He famously has a transactional attitude to diplomacy. So an issue that would confront us is if he were to demand to do something in the Middle East, which we didn't think was right, or perhaps against China, in return for the implementation of Article 5 guarantee in Europe. So if it's true that we certainly took our eye off the ball in Eastern Europe between 2000 and 2014, how much more will this be the case under Trump? So I want to conclude very quickly with a reflection on the United Kingdom's geopolitical role in any future European conflict or confrontation. It's self-evident, I think we'll all agree, that recent events have made for a more unstable and more dangerous world. I would argue, however, that they have paradoxically greatly increased the relative power of the United Kingdom. And I'm pretty much alone in saying this, particularly in Europe. But of course we can argue whether Trump will favor the United Kingdom, whether his election will cause the Europeans to move more closely together, pour encourager les autres, and therefore, as it were, isolate the United Kingdom more. That approach seems to me to miss the point in geopolitical terms. The point in geopolitical terms is that the election of Mr. Trump weakens mainland Europe. That is the overriding truth. It weakens it for the unanswerable reason that he has put Article 5 in doubt. And therefore, power being relative, the United Kingdom's power rises because it is the only power, not that it can replace the United States. The point is, it is the next power further down the line to whom others will turn in the event of an emergency. And I remember asking Norwegians, actually 4 or 5 years ago, if there is a problem with the Russians, whom do you ring? I know you ring Washington, but if Washington is engaged, whom do you ring if you have a military problem? And they admitted shamefacedly that they would ring London. And I think that's even more true today than it was then. So that means that over the next few years, a great deal will rest on the shoulders of the United Kingdom in Europe. And the importance of its armed forces, therefore, has never been greater. And I think I'll leave it at that, but I would welcome some questions and observations. Thank you.
We haven't got much time, so I think we can just limit this to 1 or 2 questions at this point. Do we have any specific questions for Brendan?
Well, thank you very much. It seems to me we are not really putting some attention to the rising possibilities of the next clash between the United States and China. And what worries me, to what extent that the hegemonic policies of the West is going to recede and try to end that potential conflict in a more peaceful way, if I can use the term.
Well, I sort of touched on it, that my anxiety about China is, well, first of all, that Mr. Trump's concern with China is pretty much entirely trade-related. So I've studied all of his comments, and he says practically nothing about South China Sea, Taiwan, and so on. And in fact, he's been very critical of US alliance systems in the Far East as well. So you could easily end up in a situation where you've got a trade conflict between the US and China, where China escalates horizontally, so to speak, over, say, the Taiwan Straits or South China Sea. And Mr. Trump doesn't actually have a strategy to deal with that. But my point being that he will then turn to the Europeans and demand support at that level. And of course, we have a great many trade links. China is, although a concern, is a remote concern. And therefore, I think it could be an area of real difficulty. And I don't see a peaceful way out of that, beyond just sitting on the sidelines, but then risking Mr. Trump saying that he won't deliver on Article 5.
Do we have one more question?
Brendan, can I challenge you a bit on the binary notion? One of the issues here is that NATO itself has decided to operate out of area and provided that as part of its justification for existence. And I agree entirely that in many respects that is sort of illogical. You know, it defines itself in regional terms as North Atlantic Alliance. And one of the issues it confronts might be a need to reorientate back to what it would see as its core area of responsibilities. In other words, regionalism as the response to globalization. But at the moment, there seems to be quite a long way to go in order for it to achieve that degree of focus, not least because it also faces another challenge, which is its primary focus Russia, Northern Europe, or is its primary focus Southern Europe, refugees flows, ISIS? So I'd welcome your comments on that. And to put it more specifically in the context of the British Army, you produced a sort of division between what you saw as a Richards approach to a Sharif approach, and I think back to the Cold War and the argument that there was a British army that was focused on the withdrawal from empire and counterinsurgents, and there was a British army stationed in BOR, which saw its focus as armour and armoured divisions. My issue is this, which is actually, is it really major war, even within a European context, that the British Army should be thinking about? And I think it's not, Chief of the General Staff tends to talk about operations at scale, but others would say, actually, that isn't the model that we're looking at, that the pressure will come at the edges rather than centrally in that way. And secondly, is it really the case that there is a choice here, or is it finding some measure of convergence? After all, David Richards went to Afghanistan as a NATO commander, as an ISAF commander. Richard Sharif was at DSACR, and of course he would reflect, therefore, the European focus that came from that responsibility. Can an army that is as small as it is really address either issue seriously, given its stress on alliances?
Well, I think the size of the army is obviously critical, and historically the point I would make is that one shouldn't make any assumptions about the size of the army from what it is now, because, think of the size of the army in 1830, think of the size of the army in 90, or after the end of the Boer War. The army expands and contracts depending on the political situation. So what, to my mind, is critical is that the political elite and the people understand what the main challenge is. And if they agree with me and Richard Sharif, or rather I agree with Richard Sharif, then one would have a completely different configuration, a completely different defense expenditure, a completely different outlook. And in saying that, I think I've also answered one of your other questions, which is, is this binary? It's obviously not completely binary in the sense that the theaters are interlinked. So Syria would be a very good example of where clearly they're linked in Mr. Putin's mind, because one of the reasons why he went in there was also to articulate his independence vis-a-vis and to leverage vis-a-vis the West, but it's also linked in Mr. Trump's mind and Mr. Flynn's mind, because they're conceiving of some kind of grand bargain, trading off European security for cooperation in the war on terror. But I think what really is, should be the driver is Europe. That is where the main threat lies. Mr. Putin has the capacity to change greatly the way in which we live, to completely change the outlook and architecture of Europe. If NATO gave way in the Baltic states, we would be in an even more different world than we are after the annexation of Crimea, which, don't forget, is the first annexation of a part of a sovereign European state by another European state since 1945, an absolutely epochal event, and of course continued with the war in the east in eastern Ukraine. So, and therefore I think that war is, that implicit war, the war that is to be deterred, is a high-end conventional war with all the potential for nuclear escalation. So it's quite close to the Cold War scenario. One has to have the capacity to fight that war. At the moment, it's really only the Americans and British in alliance with. But the question I raise, in the absence of the Americans, who does it, if not you? And if you don't do it, at what, in the Baltic states, at what point would you do it? And I hope maybe the panel will, I'll be sitting in the back listening, will pick that up if there's an opportunity, because I'd be very interested to hear some views on that.